want to start, Chris?
Yeah. I would like to start, Dave. Thank you. Wondered if we could begin with a poem. Dr. Ferguson, would you be willing to start us out with a poem
Can we
today?
maybe do introductions first? Or what is this? This is a podcast we're doing, right?
Are you sure?
I think so.
That's
We're
what
doing
I was told,
today.
but
That's what was on
whatever.
the calendar. This is the Becoming a True Human podcast.
And we
Dave
are
Lopez.
becoming true humans,
Yeah.
aren't we?
We're
And this is
truly
Chris
human.
Smith. And we're doing something out of the ordinary for Chris and I. We're having a special guest. This year, we're going to have different guests. So this is Dr. Cassie Ferguson, who is a pediatric ER doctor in Milwaukee. I'll let you kind of give your own introduction then. And you're in the process of writing a great book called The Only Life You Could Save.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So now, Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
I don't know.
I thought you weren't going to mess it up this time.
I thought we were starting with a poem. That's where I got tripped up.
Remember how I
we'll get
said we
there.
don't have an edit? I can't figure out how to edit on this video.
This is great.
so-
Dr. Ferguson, would you introduce your lovely self to the world? The world needs your voice. Would you?
I absolutely will, but you have to call me Cassie because I'm not your doctor, Chris.
Okay, fair enough.
So I'm Cassie Ferguson. I am, as stated, an emergency medicine physician for kids. So I work at our children's hospital in Milwaukee. I'm also a professor of pediatrics, and I teach medical students at the Medical College of Wisconsin. And I teach them about health system science, which is like quality improvement, patient safety, how to look at our medical world with a systems lens, thinking about preventing harm. And that idea of preventing harm, I extend to healthcare professionals, healthcare workers, including medical students that I teach. And so that naturally led to wanting to teach them about staying well and learning to care for themselves at the same time that they're learning to care for others. And I realized early on in my teaching that, while we prepare ourselves and our students for so much in medicine around diagnosis and physical exam and, even like delivering bad news and really caring for the patient, we don't talk a lot about what it feels like to be present for our patients suffering. And it took me a long time, but I realized that that's actually a skill or a set of skills, a set of practices. And so I started teaching those. First, I had to learn them because I was not taught them. But then I started figuring out how to teach them to medical students, and have been doing that since about 2015. Those are most of my hats I wear at this point. So that's who I am. I am also married to a radiologist, and I have 3 boys who are 11, 15, and 18, who are lovely. So that's me.
Thank you so much. The only thing, if I could, I would add is that you're really a wonderful human being, and I've had the pleasure to know you for a time. So I would only add that.
Well, Chris forced me into mindfulness. So I have him to thank for that.
Cassie, the other day I was scrolling and I came across this amazing quote that I wrote and put up on my wall. It goes something like this: real self-care, then, is not a retreat from the work of medicine, but a way of remaining human within it. I think you wrote that.
I wrote that.
And in part, you have an upcoming book that will be published very soon. And would you be willing to give us a window, a title, and And we'll ask some more questions, but at least let's begin with the book.
Sure. Yes, I have been, this is the first book I've ever written, maybe the last. I've been writing it for probably 5 years now, but parts of it, started with just, scrawling like thoughts that occurred to me in the middle of the night on call or, in between patients. So I feel like I've been writing it for, 20 years, but the book is called The Only Life You Could Save, which is from a Mary Oliver poem called The Journey. And, there's a lot around that name. I think we in medicine sort of, Dr. Rena Oddish, who's one of my very good friends and the author of a book called In Shock, in Shock, she sort of has this, she describes this idea of physicians as sort of like, we think of ourselves as standing on a cliff, kind of with our back to the abyss, like trying to push patients back away from the edge, like we have that kind of control. And eventually that gets exhausting. And so this concept of like, we really don't save other people. We're sort of companions on whatever journey they're on. And so I was drawn to that line in her poem. It felt very applicable to sort of my life as a physician. So I really started with the title and worked backward. So that's where that came from. And, it's evolved a great deal in those 5 years that I've been writing it. So it looks very different than when I started, for sure.
And would you be willing to give us kind of like you structured this book, and I'm just curious what went into the structure. So at least we're just trying to get a picture of the book, the title, and then its contents for those who are listening.
Sure. So, a lot of it is drawn from the talks that I give to students. And, I was trying to think of how I could share those talks outside of our institution, because not every medical school has the luxury of a required curriculum focused solely on well-being. I think we're one of the only schools in the country, at least, that have published about it. And, I realized very quickly that one of the reasons why students are so engaged in this curriculum at MCW is because they're very drawn to the storytelling, and that most of what I talk about comes from my own experience or from the experience of my patients and from former students. And so it's really hard to, formalize a curriculum around somebody else's life. So it seemed like maybe the best way to share it would be in a book. And so the book is structured around 8 obstacles that we encounter in medical training, really throughout our life as healthcare workers, beginning with those obstacles that we tend to face early and ending with those obstacles that we tend to face later on. So we begin with imposter syndrome and stereotype threat, and we end with burnout. Well, we really end with love, but we'll get to that later. We end with burnout. And the way that each chapter is structured is it's, again, very story-based. There's a lot of narrative in it. And then within each chapter, there are specific practices or skills that students can use right away. I tell students that I really will only share practices that I have used myself. Even the ones that I didn't like, I'll share them as long as I've tried them. They have to be free because students have no money, and they have to be able to be condensed into the time that it takes for you to walk from one patient's room to another patient's room.
Right.
And so those skills I find to be the most practical are the ones that made it into the book. And then at the end of each chapter, there's some reflection questions which frankly, I borrowed the idea from Chris, because Chris, I feel like you are a master at writing reflection questions. So, and that was very purposeful, so that, you know, maybe a medical school somewhere else could use this book for students. And then, you know, everyone could read the chapter and then they could come together and discuss the reflection questions as a small group, or, you know, with a partner, so that they could interact with the material and personalize it and find their own stories in it. So that's the way, that's the reason behind how it was organized.
It's beautiful. I think you made a reference, didn't maybe say it, but the REACH program. Would you be willing to talk a little bit? Because I think that's very unique as well.
Sure. So this is one of those acronyms that just felt like it had just dropped in my lap. It was REACH. One of the things that I say, I think without thinking about it anymore, at the end of most of my lectures, no matter what I'm teaching, is I will say, keep reaching out. And it is, and all of my students have my cell phone number. So I do mean it when I say that. They can contact me whenever they need me. And so REACH just became this word that, I don't know, was circling around in my brain. And so as I thought about what I could call this curriculum around well-being, way back in, it was 2018 was when I finally named it that, I thought, well, I could probably find a way to use the word REACH as an acronym. And it just happened to work really well. So REACH stands for recognize, and that's sort of in the mindfulness sense, so becoming aware. Empathize, allow, which is perhaps the hardest of the letters. Allow or accept, you know, I'll take either one of those A's. Care, and hold each other up, which I recognize is maybe a break in the acronym rules, but it worked for me. So, so yeah, that's the name of the program. It's now been incorporated into a course, a longitudinal course that runs the length of the first 2 years of medical school, that we call The Good Doctor, which once you've read the book, you'll understand, but I've renamed it The Good-ish Doctor. I feel like that's a better term to live up to. So, and I meet with the students about every month and talk to them about all these topics, which I'm sure we'll get into. And then they have the opportunity, which is really incredible, to meet in small groups of 8. And they have somebody, a faculty member, who is dubbed their learning navigator, who not only talks about them, you know, talks with them about well-being and things related to this course, but also is really sort of a connection between the student and the rest of the institution. So it becomes this really incredible home for students, I think, in those first 2 years, when it's really can get kind of lonely. And it's a place, it makes it possible. When I talk about being vulnerable, which I talk about a lot, like the importance of being vulnerable, it makes that possible. Like, I'm not just sending them out into the world to, you know, just lay themselves out there. Like they have a home to go to for that.
Thank you. Dave, I want to make sure you get a few questions in.
Yeah, I just thought we were going to start with a quote, poem. Could you read that poem, Cassie?
Sure.
That's from near the end of your book.
So this one is the one that I wrote. And then, yes. So this one, you know, it's so funny because I didn't think of it as a poem, but I'm excited because I've never thought of myself as a poet either. So that's fun. So, and this, I think, echoes everything that we talk about in the book. So it begins: we can be uncertain and still belong. We can be competent and still struggle. Our willingness to be vulnerable belies our strength. We can be whole while we're still growing and learning. Bearing witness to patient stories is the most honorable and most difficult part of our work. Meaning often emerges when certainty gives way. Caring for others both protects our energy and depletes it. Joy in medicine is not the absence of suffering, but caring for one another within it. And this one, which I continue to struggle with as a physician with over 2 decades of experience, you can love medicine and be hurt by it.
Hmm.
Yeah, I wondered if you wrote that as a poem or not, but I thought it was a wonderful poem. You know, I think it really stands as a poem as well as kind of like a bullet point list of, you know, your summary of the book and what's most important. And I really love that that line, you can love medicine and still be hurt by it. And so much of what we're taught in medicine, I think actually can hurt us. Like objectivity is the opposite of subjectivity. So the more we're taught to be objective, if we're not given permission or taught to, you know, be in touch with our own subjectivity, it can take us away from ourselves and can even feel dehumanizing. So I think that's one of the things to try to help students and residents and learners, and even in practice, I feel it myself sometimes, the loss of kind of that humanity at times when I'm being a technician. So I wonder, you know, what are your thoughts? In the book you talk about personal things, and you in psychotherapy we call it, you know, the therapeutic use of the self, where you're using yourself and your experience in a way that is taking your subjectivity and using it to teach something to the students. But I wonder how you felt about writing about personal things and your view of how much that needs to be incorporated to do this type of work.
Yeah, you know, so when I first started to learn to be a teacher, which it turns out they don't teach you in medical school, they just assume that when they give you an MD, you can, you know, be an astronaut and teach medical students and all the things. And you can't, but you can learn. And so this was probably, again, 15 years ago. I went to a conference. It was for the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. And Chip and Dan Heath are authors, and they had written a book called Switch. And one of them, I can't remember which one of them, was there at the conference, and he was talking about change. And he sort of, you know, started by posing to the crowd like, you know, when people think about change, they think it's awful, right? Nobody likes to change. Everybody hates change. There's all these phrases around sort of it's uncomfortable, it doesn't feel good, like you gotta like get up and move, you know, it's like it's exhausting, all the things. But then he started to show pictures of weddings. And he started to and you know, these were beautiful pictures where everyone's smiling and laughing and throwing their head back, and, you know, just very authentically happy, joyous people. And then he showed pictures of people holding their, you know, newborn children. And he said, you know, for people who don't claim to like change, we certainly throw ourselves into these momentous, huge shifts gladly, willingly, happily. And, you know, he used that to get into this idea of sort of the elephant and the rider, and this idea that in order to really persuade people to change, you do have to engage their emotions. You have to engage their emotional part of their brain. And that stuck with me. And I realized that really teaching somebody or learning is changing, right? It's accepting this new perspective to whatever degree feels right. And then perhaps, if we did our job, applying it to their life. And, you know, it's hard to get medical students to sit and, you know, in a lecture that's not about what's on step 1, right? Because that's really what they're focused on, is passing their boards and moving on to the next step. And so if I was going to get them to sit for an hour and hear about something that, you know, perhaps they felt had no direct applicability to their life, something like well-being, then I would have to do it in such a way that I engaged their emotional part of their brain. And for me, I found out pretty early that that was possible with stories from my life. And, you know, it started mostly clinical stories because that's where students want to, you know, they want to see themselves in those stories. They want to like start to learn what it feels like to actually do the thing that they're, you know, waiting to do. And then it slowly kind of, I started incorporating more stories from my life. And, you know, I don't have permission to share stories from, you know, like my kid's life or my husband's life or my parents' life. But I certainly, you know, felt very comfortable sharing from my perspective. And I think one of the things, particularly in medicine, that does is it makes it okay to have struggled. And that's one of the biggest obstacles, I think, in medical school, is this idea that once you've made it to medical school, you should be able to sort of navigate without difficulty, right? The gauntlet that you have to go through to get there, I think somehow impresses on students that like, okay, they assume, all these people that let me into school assume that I can do this. So now I have to do it. And I have to do it perfectly. And I have to do it, you know, sort of without batting an eyelash. And so I think it was important for me to tell them that that's not real life. And that's certainly not how I experienced it. And that it had to come from somebody who, you know, had done it before. And so I think that that was the other important piece of that was that it wasn't coming from, you know, HR or, you know, somebody that they couldn't see themselves becoming. It had to come from someone who they could relate to and who had walked the walk. So after you know, talk about your most terrifying mistake in front of 225 medical students, it's pretty easy to write a book about it. Honestly, you're like, oh, this is fine. I don't have to look at anybody in the eye. Like I'm just putting it down. So that's the long journey of how I arrived at this, or this way of writing.
Cassie, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share. I know there's two parts where you talk about perfection in the imposter phenomenon, and I think you also wrote about it in your chapter on failure. So, I mean, you can pick, but I'm just wondering if you would be willing to share one of those stories or part of those stories, because I think our listeners would certainly connect with that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of one of the stories that that I told around perfectionism. I can certainly talk about the my sort of experience with making a mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, that's a whole chapter, turns out, is making a mistake in medicine. And the shame that comes along with that. So you know, honestly, one of my inspirations to do this at all was a physician named David Hilfiker, I believe is how you say it. And he wrote an article in the New England Journal, which is sort of the, you know, preeminent medical journal, certainly has been for some time, back in 1984, I believe. And he wrote about making a mistake, and his family practice doctor, I believe, but, or maybe I'm wrong about that, but he was very clear that about saying that the consequences of making a mistake, when it literally impacts the life of another human being, are just so overwhelming that it makes it impossible for us to deal with our errors in a way that does not, you know, feel like we're drowning in shame. And the story, every year, myself and 3 other physicians and a nurse practitioner get up in front of third-year medical students, and we talk about a mistake that we made in medicine and how it impacted our emotional life. And, you know, the mistake I made was in my first year of medicine, or practicing as an attending, I should say. And I had, I'm just gonna get to that. I had been taking care of an infant who was brought in by EMS, our emergency, by ambulance, into our department. And he had been on scene for an hour or something. And he was apparently in a car crash, but we didn't really know anything else about it. And he, the EMS technician came in holding him on his hip, and he was upright and crying like any, 1-year-old would be. And he ended up decompensating very quickly. It turned out he had just a devastating head injury that was sort of very slow to show itself. And so, I think I made decisions that delayed care for him. And I don't know that it would have, I have no way of knowing, if I had done things any faster, if the outcome would have been different. We later learned that his mother had driven the car that he was riding in purposefully at something like 80 miles per hour into a tree. And so, she died on scene. It was a terrible accident. But I think the part that was the most difficult is all this was already swirling around in my head. And then a week later, we did have something called multidisciplinary trauma rounds, where we, as someone involved in a recent trauma, have to come always at 6:30 in the morning, because that's when surgeons have their meeting. So I was on overnight from 11 p.m. till 6 a.m. and walked down the hallway to this meeting, and was basically, they sort of marched through literally every minute that the patient had been in my care, and just sort of, asked me questions about why I did this and why I didn't do that. And what I write in the book was that the hardest thing to hear was one of the intensive care unit doctors said, "This child was probably going to die anyway, but you really should have called neurosurgery earlier." And, in that situation, particularly as a very young physician, you walk out of that room, and then, you immediately think that every single person in the hospital now sees into you, there's like walking by you saying like, "Oh, that's the terrible ER physician who, let that child die." And I think one of the things that I've learned is that the way that we encode these types of events is very much determines how it is that we're going to deal with them. And so I really had no one. I hadn't been there long enough to have colleagues that I trusted. I was too ashamed to talk about it with anybody that I didn't really know. And so I sat with it myself for months. Mm-hmm. And, even looking back on it now, I don't know that I've ever really changed the encoding around it. I've just learned to be able to talk about it as many times as I can in the presence of compassionate people, so that, it's received with compassion. And I think eventually in my life, I'll be able, to talk about it without the shame kind of, rising up. And, Atul Gawande, who's a surgeon, an incredible writer, he wrote very bravely in the New Yorker about a mistake that he made as a resident. And the quote that I use in the book that I say to students all the time is, there's guilt is a very natural, very sort of adaptive feeling, right? It helps us change our actions next time. It helps us sort of direct course or change course. But it's about what we do. And that shame is a sort of about who we are as people, right? So, he said something about, shame basically, eating at the core of who you feel like as a human being. You're a bad person instead of someone who did, a bad thing. And that was, I think, still to this day, probably the hardest thing that I've ever had to get over. But I also realized that if I had the skills then that I have now, it would have been very different. I would have encoded it differently. And that idea of trauma really being what happens inside in the absence of an empathic witness, that was how I experienced that. So I think that gets to the heart of, where the question started, which is this idea of perfectionism, which we all come into medical school assuming that that's the standard. And it is, it's an unreachable standard. It's very internally driven, right? It's like, well, I should not say that. It's very externally driven in the sense of when we feel as if we need to be perfect, we're really only worried about what other people think about us. And that's a really bad way to take care of patients. So perfectionism, I think, comes up in just about every single chapter that I wrote for that reason. So many other stories.
Cassie, I want to thank you for talking about that. It's really a difficult thing to go back and look at these situations again where we've lost a patient. I had a couple of years ago we lost a veteran to suicide, and I was working really closely with the primary care doc, and we all had things that we thought maybe we could have done differently. And that's part of the grief process of bargaining, the stage of bargaining where you're looking at it and you're saying, if I had done this, could this have been different? And we were also working across multiple different specialties with addiction medicine and inpatient psychiatry, trying to work with this guy who was in crisis over a number of weeks and trying to, get his dog into emergency dog care so he'd be willing to come into the hospital, and then the hospital not admitting him. And, just, it was a really kind of prolonged crisis. And there are these things that just sort of resist resolution in a way, I find. It's like you can't, no matter how many times you work with it, you can't resolve it and tie it up in a bow and say, okay, I've processed it or whatever, and now I'm done with it. But I think you can use it to teach others, and that's the gift that you're doing, is you're taking something that it's like that line where you say in the book where you say you can love medicine that can still hurt you, and that's part of it. It's how do you yourself be authentic with the suffering that you're exposed to every day, and that causes suffering within you. So you're dealing with the external suffering, and you're trying to deal with the internal suffering, and you're trying to teach this to others at the same time. So I don't know, I just want to thank you. It takes a lot of courage to do what you've done and to talk to students and to write this.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying so.
Yeah, I want to say the same thing. And I too, as you were talking, it's coming up for me, different cases that I have worked with in the mental health where that has happened. And, it's still here. And I really just appreciate your vulnerability, your willingness to speak, to tell the truth. And I can't help but think that modeling is very healing and helpful for many, many people. Certainly was for me just listening to you here. So thank you.
Of course.
Can we talk about the goodish doctor, Chris, maybe? Because that seems like it fits with this idea of perfectionism. Because on the one hand, we're all human beings and we're learning over the course of our lives, and yet we're learning sometimes at other people's expense. When we make a mistake, it's with somebody's life. And when you talked about the goodish doctor in the book, I thought about Donald Winnicott, a psychoanalyst, has a concept called the good enough mother. And his idea is you don't have to be a perfect mother. If you're perfect, actually, you interfere with the child's development. So, there's this idea of that you just have to be good enough. But, how do you reconcile this? How can you be goodish, but you're still like holding someone's life in your hands?
Great question.
Yeah. You know what's so funny? I've had several people read the book with the purpose of getting feedback from them. And one of them, who shall remain nameless, whom I love dearly, is one of my very good friends, is also a physician. And she said, I love all of it. She's like, the one thing I have a problem with is goodish. She's like, I have a really hard time thinking of myself as goodish. For her, it conjured up an idea, of mediocre, right? And, this term comes from Dolly Chugg, who is an author, and she did a whole TED Talk on this concept of being goodish. And really the idea that she's talking about is, so one, we're gonna make mistakes. Like that's just a part of it. And the problem is if we're wholly attached, if our identity is sort of like wrapped up in this idea of being a good physician, and good probably isn't strong enough. Like our identities are wrapped up in being an excellent physician, a perfect physician, perhaps, that it makes it so devastating to us when we do make a mistake, even small ones, students wouldn't think this is small, but if you fail a test and you're not harming a patient, but you fail a test, then, or when, they get negative feedback from somebody who says, you could have done this differently, that I think that, it shifts from, like, instead of saying to themselves, okay, like what does this situation require of me now? Like, how am I going to move on? How am I going to change my behavior so that I can do better the next time? How am I going to study so that I can do better the next time? As opposed to like, what are they saying about me as a human being, right? So they go from like defending their identity to taking responsibility. And I think having a looser grip on this idea of being a good or excellent physician is what I, really liked about Dolly Chugg's argument. Is it's not that you're aiming for mediocrity. It's that you are loosening your grip on perfection enough that you can change your behavior when it is rightly called out. Like if you said something you shouldn't have said, you should be called out for it so that you can change and do better next time. And if you're so attached to being a good physician and there's no wiggle room there, it's very hard to let that in. So, I texted her back and I was like, well, we might need to have a conversation about this. She's like, yeah, no, I should probably talk with my therapist about that. So I was like, at least she could like see it, right? Like, I think it kind of made sense to her after that. But I think that is central to professional formation. Like, you cannot transform if you don't if you don't give yourself the room to do that. So that has been a core concept in the course from the very beginning. I started talking about this the very first year of REACH. And it's a lecture every year. And, students say the same thing that my colleagues said. It's really hard for them to kind of see this in a way that makes room for excellence, right? Like, excellence is not a bad thing. It's when we don't leave room to get more excellent.
Cassie, so everyone knows I'm not been to medical school. I'm not a doctor, but I did read your book. And one of the things that was helpful for me with the word goodish, as a patient, is it opens up for me more collaboration with my provider. That word gives me some, I don't look at them as this on the tower, you know, and I just thought that's the type of physician I want. I'm okay for my physician to be goodish. I don't want one that thinks they're perfect. But it leaves room for me to at least have conversations, to be more on equal footing. So for me, that concept was very helpful as a patient.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, that always reminds me of, I think, Pema Chodron's quote around sort of compassion as a relationship between equals, right? Like, otherwise it morphs into pity. You know, if I'm up here being excellent, and that's the relationship, or that's the sort of the character that my patient sees, then it's very hard to have a healing relationship. So we talk about that as well a lot, because I think at the heart of all of this is that we want to take good care of patients. I mean, that's really what this is about. So.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to develop a professional identity that's always striving for, you know, lifelong learning and doing the best you can, but recognizing that you're still human, operating in an uncertain world. And also, too, you were talking about, was it from Ron Oddish, the idea of that your back is to the abyss, and can you talk about that some? Because that seems tied into the idea of goodish, of like, you're not going to be able to stop death.
No. Yeah. And that's honestly, I mean, when there is a whole chapter on grief. And I think that's the hardest thing about witnessing suffering and witnessing death, is because you assume that you had something to do with it. Always, you know, you could have cared for a patient for 5 minutes, you know, and that happens in the ER all the time, right? Like, this patient spends every day of their life out of your care, and then they come in and for 5 minutes you take care of them, and they have a bad outcome, right? Perhaps they die, or are very sick. You know, the sort of ego that it takes to think that you really had something to do with that, or that, you know, you could have stopped it had you been a little bit better, is, I mean, it's kind of reckless and dangerous, not only to our like well-being, but that, you know, with that kind of sort of approach to medicine, you leave everybody else out, including the patient, right? You leave the patient's family out, you leave all the other team members out. And that's not how we practice. That doesn't work.
Cassie, I'm wondering, I feel like now would be a good time to talk about love.
Yeah.
My favorite.
And this is just me. You don't have to do that, but your story about Meg just unravels me every time. But again, you can say whatever you want, but I thought love would be a great place to head next.
Yeah, you know what's so funny is my editor, who I love to death, he's just a wonderful human being. He's an ENT surgeon, writer, blogger, all the things. You know, I've been writing one chapter at a time and sending it to him, and he would edit it and send it back. And we got to love, and he was like, I don't know about this. It was the same thing. It was like, he's like, I think I just need to get more comfortable with the idea of love. He's like, I think I love my patients. You know, it was like this whole back and forth about like, what place does love? He's like, are you sure you don't want to like call it compassion? I was like, we've used the word compassion 1,000 times. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about love. And the story that I start the chapter with was, and actually what I really want to say is the quote that I start the chapter with is from Ross Gay, who's one of my most favorite poets and authors. And his book of delight, it's just in the other book of delight, like he's a book of more delights, all the books of delights, I just adore. But in one of those books, the first one, I believe, he wrote, what if we joined our sorrows? I'm saying, what if that is joy? And that idea that, and Chris, you and I have talked about this, that like, it feels very difficult just to think about holding, those two things at the same time, like holding sorrow and joy at the same time. And so I was thinking about like, how does that actually look? Like, how does it turn up? It's very poetic and beautiful, but is it true? Like, is it true in our life? And I, thought of this story of, I was taking care of an infant who, it turned out had a devastating head injury that was related to abuse. And we were finding this out in real time. And she came in awake and alert and looking around. And then, over the course of an hour was, we realized that she had bleeding in her brain and she had to be intubated, and she went to the OR directly to have a drain placed in her skull. And I'm trying to relay this on to her mother. And, at the end of it, I just remember standing in the trauma bay by myself because everyone else had left. And it was just this idea of like, okay, like, got to take a deep breath, like, and I remember this idea that like, I just inhaled. I don't remember exhaling right away, just like that, holding your breath, going back out. I knew I had a million patients waiting for me who probably didn't care that I was, in a resuscitation. They were more worried about their own child and wanted to be cared for. And I came out ready to do that. And one of my very good friends, Meg, who's a colleague, had, while I was in the department, or while I was in the trauma bay, had taken care of all my patients, had staffed all my residents, and was just waiting by, where we sit. And she didn't say anything. She just looked at me and opened her arms. And, just as I had just been comforting the mother of this child, like, she did the same thing for me. And, in the emergency department, you can't stay in sorrow. Like, it's not a place that you can stay for very long, but you have to get used to, and it feels uncomfortable. You have to get used to like letting yourself laugh, like you have to get used to thinking something is funny, or, delighting in pizza or what, like someone bringing in a bag of candy, like, and it's the juxtaposition of like, devastating head trauma and like being excited for a bag of Skittles is weird, but like I don't think there's anywhere else in the world that just sort of marries those things so perfectly. And I realized when I was thinking about that story is that was that love just gets sort of moved around, right? Like it goes, that mother was loving her child, and then I was trying to love that mother, and then Meg was loving me, and it just kind of moves around in a way, just as like all of the terribleness is moving around. And so maybe they're not like necessarily, that you don't necessarily hold them both at the same time, but they're just always both present. So yeah, I just don't think that we talk about it enough. That I don't think we use the word enough.
I'm really moved by this idea of also being aware of love at work in the context of an ER room. That's what I loved about that chapter, was that you brought to me the awareness of that possibility in a place where maybe it's so easy not to look or to experience or to feel or even share that aspect of, again, love. So yeah, that was just really powerful. In some ways, it reminded me of this story. And Dave, you will know the reference. You're always so good at this. But this monk walking serenely across the battlefield, and how just the sight of that caused one to, this leader to totally change the way that they went about how they ruled, ruled with more compassion and kindness. So I just really admire that, and thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, Chris, I'm goodish on that one. I don't have the reference. I'm goodish on the references. But
see, doesn't that feel better?
Cassie, I mean, there's so many things in your book that remind me of things I've written about, and so I feel like we're on to, the same sort of thing that we're trying to find the language, how to talk about human things in medicine where we often don't talk about human things. And in Rehumanizing Medicine, I also write about love a fair amount. And one of the things that gave me permission was the old American Holistic Medical Association had 10 principles of holistic medicine. And so, one of those, it was the number 2 on the list, the healing power of love. Holistic healthcare practitioners strive to meet the patient with grace, kindness, acceptance, and spirit without condition, as love is life's most powerful healer.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where'd we lose sight of that?
Yeah. I don't know.
It was written down.
Yeah. The objectivity, I think, where love isn't objective. I don't know if there's evidence-based, if it's an evidence-based intervention to love somebody, although there is evidence about compassion now. So in Compassionomics, the authors talk about that compassion should be considered an evidence-based intervention.
Then, yeah, I don't like that.
Yeah, right. Compared to love.
I like that. What, Chris, you say this, I consider it practice-based evidence. So, and I think that that's what, like the students, when you can just kind of remind them that they have feelings, and that those feelings are, they don't even have to own the feelings, they're just, this is what happens because it's your nature, right? It's our nature to love. It's our nature to feel like we want to help people and feel that compassion toward them. And so when it comes up, you can acknowledge it and that's okay. And I hope that just by like reminding them of that, then when it does come up, they're not immediately aversive to, it's not like pushing it away. It's like, oh, that's there. They don't really, even if nothing changes, the doves don't start flying out from the patient room. Like it's just at least acknowledged. So I think that would be a big step, even if we can't publish an article about it.
Did you think about using the word lovish?
Good idea.
I think lovish is
sort of lovey.
It's no, I put the Kopacz, like he tried to change it in many different ways. I said, no, we're just using the word.
Well, does it feel like we're ready to begin to wind down a little bit?
I think so. Chris, I've got one question I wanted to ask Cassie. Do you have anything final before?
I got a few, but go ahead first.
Okay. I mean, the one thing I wanted to ask you, Cassie, was, so you've spent so much time writing this book and now you're talking with us. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that's really, really close to your heart that you wanted to bring up in the talk today about your book or about your experience?
I mean, I think one of the things that I struggled with the entire time I was writing it, and I don't know if struggled's the right word, but had front of mind the entire time. I mean, I started by telling you that one of the courses I teach is health system science. So I am like exquisitely aware of the systemic and organizational factors that make well-being in medicine very difficult. But I think what I really wanted this book to be was an acknowledgement that that's true, and an acknowledgement that no one has come to save us yet, and that we are suffering now, and as a result our patients are suffering now, and you know, that in order to be, and I think this gets back to our discussion of, you know, Thich Nhat Hanh, and this idea of, you know, engaged Buddhism is this, like, if you don't, like, we are going to have to save ourselves here, and that to be the people who eventually change the systems so that it is better for generations to come, we have to be well ourselves. And, you know, how are we going to do that? And there, you know, so it felt, there were times I was writing the book that I felt like, ooh, like there's a reason why students, you know, feel competitive. There's a reason why students have imposter syndrome, and it's not their fault, right? And, but so balancing that idea was tricky. And I hope that, you know, I still hope that I did that, and will probably continue to edit until, you know, the final hour to make sure that I do that. But I did want that to be abundantly clear that I see both, and that both are important.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, would you mind just the name of your book, how people might reach out to you, and when your book will be available for the world?
Absolutely. So the book is called The Only Life You Could Save. I'm hoping somewhere towards the middle of 2026 is when it's going to come out. And when it does come out, it will be available on all the places that books tend to be available. So Amazon and barnesandnoble.com and all those places. I'll certainly have it for sale on my website. The easiest way to find me, I really am not on any social media except for Substack, which is kind of a writer's platform. And that my Substack is Cassie Craun Ferguson, which is my name as it appears. And so you can find me on Substack that way. And if you subscribe to my Substack, which is free, because I don't charge anyone to do that, I have more things that I've written. And then that's how I'm going to make people aware of when the book is actually published. So that would be the easiest way to track that.
And as a reader of your Substack, I just want to say it is great stories. It's wisdom. Yeah, I just always appreciate what you share on Substack.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Cassie, for joining Dave and I on Becoming a True Human.
Absolutely.
So, Dave, any final words?
Yeah, weren't we going to end with a poem?
Yeah, those are the final words.
All right.
Those are the all right. Well, this is one of my most favorite poems. It's called Gaudiamus Igitur, and it is, which is, therefore let us rejoice, is how that roughly translates in Latin, I am told. The story is great, but it's the common name of a German commencement hymn. So for graduation, this used to be sung. And the formal title of Gaudiamus Igitur was De Brevitate Vitae, which is on the shortness of life. So, which of course was written by a Stoic, a Roman philosopher, Seneca. So, and John Stone was a cardiologist, a wonderful human being, wrote this poem, Gaudiamus Igitur, for a graduating class. So a medical school graduating class at Emory, which is where he was for many, many years. This is back in 1982. The poem is much longer than this, but this is one of my favorite parts. And then I'll skip to the very end of the poem, which is my other favorite part. So it begins this way. For this is the end of examinations. For this is the beginning of testing. For death will give the final examination, and everyone will pass. For the sun is always right on time, and even that may be a reason for a kind of joy. For there are all kinds of all degrees of joy. For love is the highest joy. For which reason the best hospital is a house of joy, even with rooms of pain and loss, exits of misunderstanding. For there is the mortar of faith, for it helps to believe. For Mozart can heal and no one knows where he's buried. For penicillin can heal, and the word and the knife. For the placebo will work and you will think you know why. For the placebo will have side effects and you will know you do not know why. For none of these may heal, for joy is nothing if not mysterious. And then he ends the poem, which is how I end the book, with, for the heart will lead, for the head will explain, but the final common pathway is the heart, whatever kingdom may come. For what matters finally is how the human spirit is spent, for this is the day of joy, for this is the morning to rejoice, for this is the beginning, therefore let us rejoice. Gaudeamus igitur. Such a good poem.
Mm. Wow, thank you.
Yes, thank
Yeah.
you.
Of course.
That's a good place to end then. So thanks so much, Dr. Cassie Craun Ferguson, and we'll look forward to your
Get her
book.
book, get her book, get her book.
Yeah, The Only Life You Could Save. And we will activate our enormous kind of social network to promote your book when it comes out.
Awesome.
Yep. I think Chris is your job, Chris, is talk to Oprah to get this on Oprah's book club.
Well,
I
it's
think-
already happening.
Right. You're already in talks with Oprah?
Yep. And Reese Witherspoon too, so.
Of course. It's got to be on Reese's list as well.
Yeah.
She's in the book.
So she's gotta, yeah, you're right.
I know she has to.
Well, thanks so much, Cassie, and
Thanks so
thanks
much.
everybody for watching today, and we'll see y'all next month.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.